Welcome back to Studio 2. I'm Avi Wolfman-Arent.
And I'm Cherry Gregg. We're going to talk about immigration now. It's an issue that is constantly in the news. Just yesterday, a Texas immigration law that would make illegal border crossings a state crime and allows Texas officials to apprehend and deport undocumented immigrants. Well, it was blocked again. The conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that the law could go into effect on Tuesday, but hours later, a federal appeals court order put it on hold.
Back and forth. And of course, the immigration issue is also at the forefront of the presidential election. Just over the weekend, former President Trump stoked fears again about our southern border, using dehumanizing language to describe migrants. But while there's a lot of rhetoric and worry about undocumented migrants, what's the real impact of immigration on our economy and culture? Wharton professor Zeke Hernandez argues in a forthcoming book that overwhelmingly immigrants are a boon for America. His book is called The Truth About Immigration, and we invited him to share that truth here today on Studio 2. Zeke Hernandez, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you have a comment or question about the immigration debate and the effect of immigrants on our economy, call us, 888-477-9499. You can also email studio2 at whyy.org.
And so, Zeke, we want to start the conversation because you argue in your book that much of the American rhetoric around immigrants, specifically those who come here as undocumented people, that it paints immigrants as villains or victims. You argue that both depictions are unfair, negative assessments of newcomers to this country. I want you to lay out what you see as the truth.
Well, yeah, what you label as the villain argument is a lot of what we're hearing in the political rhetoric, that immigrants take our jobs, that they undermine our culture, that they threaten our safety. But interestingly, most of us haven't really imbibed a good counter-argument to that.
Yeah.
If you think about it, while we love Emma Lazarus's poem about the poor huddled masses, actually, it's done quite a disservice because a poor huddled mass is like someone to be pitied, someone who might cost us a lot to help. But it turns out that the facts don't show that. So the poor huddled masses argument isn't a counter-argument to the villain narrative. So the truth about immigration is that immigrants are net positive contributors to everything you want for your community to be prosperous. Job creation, investment, cultural vitality, innovation, you name it. Whatever's on your wish list, immigrants contribute positively to it. And that's a fact. That's not just opinion. The evidence shows that really clearly.
What's so interesting, and you lay this out in the beginning of your book, is that you're born in a different country. You're from South America.
Correct.
When you were thinking about coming to America, you had so imbibed, as you say, those counter-arguments about immigration that you were hesitant to come here because you thought you'd be taking a spot from a native-born American. Explain your personal journey and how it feeds into your thesis.
I came to the U.S. to study. I actually had received a scholarship to come study at a university, and I had several American friends, and one of them said to me, and he didn't say this to me in a malicious way, but he said, if you come, you're going to steal a scholarship and a job and probably a girl from a deserving American. And I wasn't angry. Mm-hmm. I actually thought he's probably right. Immigration might be good for me, but maybe I'm doing harm. And I had a kind of a raging internal debate about whether I should come because I was very worried.
You felt real guilt about this.
I did. And it has been a journey of many years to realize that there was nothing to worry about. So when people worry about immigrants, I get it because I worried about being an immigrant myself.
And I want to go back a little bit before we start going through all the misconceptions and the myths about immigration, because there is a history in this country of villainizing newcomers, whether they be the Italians, Irish, Jewish, Chinese. Can you walk us through some of this history and the origins of this negative sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's always an argument about, this new wave of immigrants is different, right? And they're really going to hurt us. And that's what one of our leading presidential candidates is arguing right now. But it's always been that way. The first group that spooked Americans were the Irish. And the Irish were supposed to never assimilate. They were Catholic. They wouldn't accept the Constitution. They'd be loyal to the Pope. The Irish have done fine, right?
Yeah.
Then it was the Chinese who came to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And actually, our first immigration exclusion law in the U.S., 1882, was to exclude Chinese workers under the argument that they threaten American workers. That turns out not to be true. Then it was Germans, right? The Germans were different. They weren't Protestant. They were Lutheran. They spoke a different language. They started German schools, and even our beloved Benjamin Franklin here in Philadelphia sort of made arguments about Germans. Of course, that was years before the time I'm talking about, but people were spooked by them. And then it was the Scandinavians. Now, the real turning point in American history that like completely freaked out the establishment happened around 1890 when you stopped having Western and Northern Europeans coming, and you started having Southern and Eastern Europeans. So all of a sudden you have Italians, Poles, Greeks, Ukrainians who were Jewish, Catholic, and this created a panic that resulted by 1924 in the National Origins Act, which shut the door on immigration for essentially 40 years. Immigrants went from being 15% of our national population to less than 5%, which is a gigantic decline. And the argument was these Southern and Eastern Europeans can't handle democracy. Asians, by the way, were banned completely. They can't handle democracy. They're too different. And, today it's Latin Americans and Asians. So it's always been that, supposedly the most recent wave is inferior, unassimilable, and if you look at the historical evidence, every group has done just fine, right? Today we have the descendant of a German American, our leading candidate for the Republican Party, arguing that Latin Americans and Asians can't assimilate, when 100 years ago people were making that very argument about his own predecessor. So, it's
fascinating.
It's interesting, yeah.
Let's talk about the economic impact, because one of the main arguments you hear from folks who are against immigration or want to restrict immigration is that immigrants destabilize the labor force, cause wages to fall, or, in layman's terms, take jobs from native-born Americans. What does the research actually say?
The short answer is it's exactly the opposite is true, right? And we let's split it into why immigrants are not harmful. But then I think the more interesting conversation, and the part that we in some ways never get to, is why they're positive. So, so it's very different to say they're not negative than to say they're net positive.
But let's start with not negative.
Let's start with
because
not
that's
negative.
the part that's really hard for people to wrap their minds around.
That's
you
right.
talk about a carpenter here in Philadelphia who sees folks, day laborers, taking work from carpenters, and he says, how could this not be a net negative for me?
Yeah. My carpenter friend is really emblematic of that, right? He's a very skilled carpenter. He gets paid very well for his work. But he worries about those day laborers. He thinks they undermine him. And it seems to make sense, right? Because if you think, well, here we are in Philadelphia and there's more carpenters that come in. Aren't they competing for the same jobs as I am? And isn't that going to undermine my wages? And so I can see the intuition. But it turns out when you look at the facts, it just does not happen. In fact, immigrants are net job creators. Now, at first, you'd think, well, why can't that can't be, right? They can't be.
Supply and demand. How could that be?
Supply and demand. The laws of supply and demand must be wrong. Well, the problem is that the argument is based on thinking only about supply but not demand.
Yep.
Because what happens is, yes, there's now a greater supply of, say, carpenters in Philadelphia, but what happens when hundreds or thousands of immigrants move to Philadelphia? They also need food, housing. They need schooling. They need entertainment. They want to go to a restaurant and eat. So all of that has to grow to accommodate the growing population. So demand for goods and services is growing. So you just have a bigger pie, which needs, yes, more people eating the pie, but also more people building the pie to begin with, right? But it's not just that you have a bigger pie. To continue the analogy, I don't know if this is going to work. You also have pies of entirely different flavors that show up, because the techniques and the skill sets that the foreign carpenters bring are different than what my native-born American carpenter has. They might do different jobs. Because they don't speak English well, my carpenter friend is the foreman, and the other carpenters might do the parts of the work that don't require English skills. And so what happens is you also have not just more people, but people who kind of allocate into different roles in the economy.
It creates a sort of dynamism.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you another example. So imagine you're walking through your supermarket aisle and think of the things that you buy every day, right? And if we start removing the foods that were introduced by immigrants just to Philadelphia, at least half of your cart would be empty.
Yep.
Right? Pasta.
Yeah.
Pierogies, sushi. I almost can't think of an American food that doesn't exist because newcomers brought it, right? And so all of a sudden, it's not that, all these foods compete with each other. They just kind of broaden your palate, right? And so there's now room for restaurants and producers to offer all these kinds of foods. Anyway.
All of that consumption stemming from immigration at some point along the way.
Exactly. And that's why it's not zero sum.
Yeah, it expands. If you are just tuning in, we're speaking about the real impact of immigration on our economy and culture with Zeke Hernandez, professor at the Wharton School and author of the forthcoming book, The Truth About Immigration. If you have a question or comment about the immigration debate and the effect of immigrants on our economy, you can call us. The number is 888-477-9499 or email studio2@whyy.org. And Zeke, I think about Philadelphia and how Philadelphia, the population here was stagnant for decades. And in, the early 2000s, we saw this influx of immigrants moving into this country. And for the first time in over a generation, we saw, population growth. Can you talk about how immigration helps take stagnant populations, stagnant economies, and the impact of this flux of new people, what it does for a city like a Philadelphia?
Yeah, exactly. So Philadelphia went from single digits in terms of the fraction of immigrants in the population to today about 15% of Philadelphia's population is foreign-born. And it's not a coincidence that has coincided with an economic renaissance of sorts for our city. Why? And this is where we go from talking about just the not negative to the why immigrants are positive economically. Immigrants are 80% more likely than natives to start a business. So when you get foreign-born people, they're starting new businesses. Okay, everything from the new corner restaurant or the corner store selling, remittances and calling cards, to high-tech businesses look, we wouldn't be having this show were it not for immigrants, right? The microprocessors that make it possible for us to communicate, introduced to the U.S. Largely by immigrants. If you had a Zoom meeting today, that's an immigrant-started business. The COVID vaccine that allows us to gather and not still be under a pandemic, essentially discovered by immigrants, right? So all of these new things just create vibrancy in the economy. The other thing that immigrants do, and this is one of the great untold stories about immigration that I hope people get it. It's that immigrants increase the amount of investment in your community. So without investment, you can't create jobs, you can't create new businesses. So investment is the beginning of economic growth. And immigrants increase investment in two ways. One is they act as a magnet for investment from their home countries, right? So if you have Germans that move to the U.S., German firms are more likely to invest in the U.S. and, the same for any other nationality. The other is that in starting businesses, they put their own capital into the economy or they raise capital from other sources to grow that business, right? Whether it's venture capital, private equity, or whatever grows a business. And so the seeds of economic growth are often planted by immigrants through the investment they attract.
You mentioned in the book the example of this restaurant called Pollo Campero, which I grew up with because I was in the Maryland suburbs, and there were many immigrants from El Salvador and Guatemala, and all of a sudden Pollo Campero started popping up, all around us. It's like some of the best chicken I don't do chicken anymore, but it's some of the best chicken you've ever had in your life. And it became very popular first, of course, with the immigrant community, but then people like me started hearing about it and going to Pollo Campero. And I think you say it goes from the Sanchez's to the Smiths, right? And so there is like this chain effect. I do have to bring in this question, though, from Alan that you anticipate in the book, and you knew you were going to get it. Are both legal and illegal immigrants beneficial to the economy? Do you differentiate among them? And you do in the book, and you do address this question, so I'll let you take it.
It's a great question. Alan, right? Alan, thank you for asking the question. It's a great question. It's a fair question. It's always the first question. But you can't make sense of the question without covering some of what we already covered, right? Because if you don't understand the effect that immigrants have on our economy and our culture, which we haven't covered, you can't make sense of what illegal or undocumented immigrants do. The short answer is that from an economic standpoint, there is no difference. The economy doesn't care, right? Whatever your documented status is, you can bring a new idea. You can bring in new tastes and preferences, et cetera. And so from an economic standpoint, it doesn't matter. It does matter in one way, is that by not being documented or legal, you do have a limit into how much you can do. For example, my barber is an undocumented immigrant, and he's very, very good. He's actually won a lot of awards internationally for his work, but he's not documented here. One time he was cutting my hair, and I just about fell off my chair. He told me that his dream, we have a very good rapport. He said, my dream is to start my own barbershop. He said, I have $200,000 in cash saved, ready to start my own business, but I can't because I'm not legal, right? And so they bring all the same benefits, but the fact that they can't fully participate in the economy because they're undocumented limits the upside of what they can contribute. Having said that, my claim isn't that it's good for immigrants to be illegal or that it's good for the law to be broken. I think the most important question is, why do we have such a large undocumented population, right? We have about 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in this country. When you have that many illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, it's not just a matter of a few bad apples. It's that our whole system for bringing apples into the U.S. is messed up, right? We don't even replace the number of working-age Americans who die every year with immigration, let alone retirees and all, right? And so when our system of allowing people in is so far removed from the economic needs that our country has, you're going to get irregular immigration, right? Yeah. It's just going to happen. So we need to fix the system. So undocumented immigration isn't good, but it's our fault. It's our legal system's fault that the problem exists.
But don't you also go on to argue in the book, because, and this is not undocumented necessarily, but people make this association, you do differentiate between low-skill, middle-skill, high-skill immigrants and their impact on the economy, their net contribution.
Sure.
And it does show that low-skill immigrants are sort of better net contributors to the economy than low-skill native workers. Is that correct? Is my understanding correct?
I would just change one word, not better, but just different.
Okay.
Different net contributors and positive net contributors. Of course, we all want, I use the analogy of we all want more Ferraris in our economy, but we need a lot of Toyotas and Hyundais as well, right?
Yeah.
So for example, undocumented immigrants, or actually, let's go to unskilled immigrants without college degrees, many of whom are undocumented, but not exclusively. They do jobs that Americans simply don't want to do, right? One example that I find very stark is North Carolina, 2011. Farmers there have 6,500 job openings. We're still in the aftermath of the financial crisis, so there's 500,000 North Carolinians unemployed, 500,000. And only 238 of them apply for farm jobs. 137 of them show up for the first day, and only 7 finish the harvest.
Wow.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. Americans just don't want farm jobs. So who has to come do them? It's immigrants. And that's the same is true for, household services, a lot of construction jobs, a lot of kind of low-end manufacturing. These are jobs that are essential for our economy to function. Someone has to do them. And immigrants are just not competing with natives for them. So it's their toehold. They're kind of their first step into climbing into the American dream. And the other thing, I hope I'm not being too long-winded here, but research also shows that actually benefits unskilled American workers, because as immigrants take these sort of starter jobs, it allows American unskilled workers to shift into positions that favor their language skills and other skills. And actually, those skills pay more. So the research shows that the more immigrants you have in a state that are doing low-skilled work, the more the wages of unskilled natives go up.
And Zeke, I want to talk about this transition period when people come to this country, and we have this influx of migrants coming to America, and there's all this negative rhetoric. But I thought that the town of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, is a great example because it was once a struggling coal city that was on the decline. A wave of Latino immigrants came to town, but the story, Zeke, had a very dark, violent, racist start before they got to this bright side. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, this is a story that I learned from Andrew Seeley. He's the president of the Migration Policy Institute, so I'll give him credit for that. Hazleton, a classic Rust Belt town, as you said, was declining. What happened is that, if you'd walked the streets of Hazleton in the 80s, it would have been really depressing, right? Shuttered shops, closed factories. In the 90s, a wave of Hispanic immigrants, mainly from Mexico, kind of moved from New York looking for lower cost of living. Yeah, and it was kind of a precedent to all the debate we're having right now. The residents of Hazleton were very angry. They claimed that immigrants were increasing crime, changing the culture, undermining, the economy, taking jobs. And by the way, Hazleton still has a lot of problems. But unexpectedly, these immigrants not unexpectedly if you know the evidence. First, they started their own small businesses, and now there are 4 factories in the Hazleton area, all of which have been opened with Mexican capital and are creating jobs there. Now, it's no coincidence that Mexican capital followed Mexican immigrants.
That's the magnet effect you talked about earlier.
That's the investment effect.
And then they hired Americans.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So
like overwhelmingly, there's jobs for Americans. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do have to bring in this email from Jason because it's another thing you address in the book, and you do address it head on. While I can't disagree with the long-term economic impact of immigration, how do you address the current and substantial financial costs associated with dealing with resettling the recent influx of immigrants to cities like Denver and New York? And you admit there's nuance here. For local economies in the short term, this can be a hit and a burden to taxpayers. True?
No doubt, Jason. Yeah, good point. And it's the right question. We need to figure out how to solve this. The numbers are clear that in the short run, places that receive large and unexpected inflows of immigrants suffer costs, right? The immigrants in the short run, and by short run I mean months or maybe the first year or two, they cost states a lot. You have to educate the children, provide temporary housing, health
Real quick,
care.
though, you mentioned children. That surprised me. I thought that the cost would be emergency housing. You say the biggest cost, right, is public education for the children.
The biggest cost, that's right. So a good estimate is that it costs a state, a first-generation immigrant costs a state, on average, $1,600. This is assuming all the costs are borne immediately anyway, some complex finance issues. But and that's primarily because of the cost of educating children, because immigrants have more children than natives on average. So we have to figure that out, because the problem is really that the federal government has taken no action. Right?
The costs are inequitably distributed, and there's no defraying of the costs on the federal level.
Exactly.
Okay.
So when Mayor Adams of New York or the mayor of Denver complains, they have a point. I mean, they're saying things that aren't totally true, but that's a fair point. Right? Their localities are bearing a disproportionate share of the cost, and there's no scheme for the U.S. government to reimburse or help cover those costs. Mm-hmm. However, this is what we have to keep in mind. In the long run, localities are better off by welcoming immigrants, fiscally speaking. So the children and grandchildren of immigrants bring more than about double the fiscal benefit compared to what the cost is of the first generation. But that takes a long time. We're talking decades, right? So it's very fair for a mayor to say, well, yeah, but I have to bear the short-term costs
right now. Yeah,
it's very fair. But this is not just the president not doing anything, because the president doesn't have the authority to do everything that needs to be done. Congress has to act and pass a scheme to reimburse and help localities. And the problem is our political stalemate doesn't allow that.
Before we let you go, I want to bring in the counterfactual example, which is, let's say, an advanced economy that does not have a lot of immigrants and an aging population. The country I often think about is Japan. I don't know if they're the perfect one or not, but that's the thing that always rings in my mind. What happens if we just turn off immigration? What happens to a society? What happens to an economy? Because some people would certainly want to do that. What happens if we become, as you put in the book, an immigration beggar?
Well, we know what happens. So look, Japan is actually the perfect poster child and warning signal for America. But we actually know what happens in America itself. In 1924, one of the reasons this book was written is because we're exactly 100 years from the 1924 National Origins Act. That act essentially shut the door of immigration in America with very few exceptions. And what happened? We have evidence that the innovation machine of the U.S. suffered. American inventors were nearly 70% less productive. American businesses patented over 53% less. Jobs were lost for native workers. To this day, places that suffer the decline of immigrants the most from the 1924 law have fewer investment ties to the rest of the world.
Wow.
Okay? Now, the other thing that happened in the intervening years is we had the baby boom, and the rest of the world, the rest of the world was destroyed by World War II. So you could say, well, didn't America thrive? Yeah, but those were very weird conditions.
Well, that's why I bring up Japan, though, because that does seem like a society that if they don't get an influx of immigration could have some real economic imbalance.
And they've become immigration beggars. They're desperate to create a foreign worker scheme. We're going to be in the same position if we don't get our act together.
And we only have about a minute left. But if you in 30 seconds could have a few policies, what would be the one thing that America could do to actually be more of a welcoming place for immigrants?
Remove the Department of Homeland Security as the one responsible for immigration. Give it to an agency that frames immigration positively. The rest kind of goes from there.
Interesting. That is Zeke Hernandez, professor at the Wharton School, author of the forthcoming book, The Truth About Immigration. Comes out, Zeke, June 4th. Look for that, June 4th. It's called The Truth About Immigration.